Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
What has to be one of my favorite science fiction films of all time, and possibly my favorite sci-fi film of this decade, Interstellar is a beautiful tale of family and humankind at its tipping point. It shows us the best and worst of humanity in the direst of circumstances. Directed by Christopher Nolan and featuring an incredible cast, the film is an exploration of interstellar space that should be viewed with an extremely wide screen. With terrific cinematography and an equally jaw-dropping soundtrack by Hans Zimmer, it's a film that has been crafted with great love and care. Caltech theoretical physicist Kip Thorne was even brought on to work as scientific advisor to ensure that they got most of the hard science correct, with a little bit of breathing space for artistic license. The premise of the film is that the Earth has been corrupted to the point that nothing will be able to grow on its soil. Faced with the possible destruction of our species, a secret project was being developed to preserve humankind. Coinciding with the decay of our planet, a black hole had been discovered 48 years prior to the present day, on the other side of which was essentially a distant solar system. This led NASA to commence work on a Lazarus mission, which sent 12 astronauts to 12 separate worlds that had been located through the wormhole, that may serve as possible substitutes for another Earth. Unfortunately, with limited resources, it was a one-way trip. The astronauts had 2 years worth of life in their capsules, which would enable them to work for multiple years using the sleep chambers to hibernate for most of their time to conserve food and resources. If the right conditions for habitation were discovered, the astronauts were instructed to turn on a beacon which would inform NASA to send their subsequent Endurance mission to that location. Those who had landed on each of the planets that had no potential for life had to accept their fate and essentially die alone. Even those that had discovered a planet with potential for life had no guarantee that the Endurance would be able to travel to them and pick them up. The second part of the plan was to send a follow-up crew to confirm the discoveries and begin the setup of equipment to facilitate the first habitation of our species on another world. It's explained that only 3 of the 12 planets had sent a beacon back to Earth, leading Cooper, a retired astronaut with the most flying experience of anyone currently available, Amelia Brand, a scientist, Doyle, a geographer, and Romilly, an astrophysicist, to investigate each of the 3 planets. The film begins with a look at Cooper's family, who live on a farm and are struggling to maintain their crops. His daughter Murphy informs him that she has a ghost in her room that is knocking books down, but Cooper doesn't take much note of it at first, and tells her to use the scientific method to determine the validity of her hypothesis, instead of jumping to conclusions. Cooper's father, Donald, played by the outstanding John Lithgow, also let him know that their neighbours have begun burning their crops in preparation for what is said to be the last harvest. On their way to school, Cooper, Murphy and his son Tom find a rogue drone flying above them and follow it in the hopes of salvaging its solar parts. Cooper speculates that it must have been flying low due to some sort of interference from a signal. This theory is compounded by the news that all their tractors and equipment belonging to their neighbours, which run automatically, have driven themselves to the edge of Cooper's home. Cooper's neighbour explains that his attempts to recalibrate them has been in vain, as some sort of magnetism is interfering with their compass, causing them to move towards their house. Upon further investigation, they head to Murphy's room, where she explains she's trying to communicate with the bookshelf using Morse code, but Cooper insists that her bookshelf is not trying to communicate with her. He resets all of the equipment to take the magnetic anomaly into account, but he still is unaware of the cause. As the weather on the planet worsens, a severe blight sends dust into Murphy's room, which shows a distinctive pattern of lines, causing Cooper to second-guess his initial assumptions. After spending the night in the room, he realizes it's not magnetism, but gravity that is pulling everything into those patterns. Realizing this is a binary code, he determines it's a set of coordinates. This ultimately sends Cooper and Murphy to investigate, which leads them upon the discovery of a secret research facility. After Cooper explains that gravity had led them to that location, Dr. Amelia Brand and her father John, along with a group of scientists, reveal that they are actually NASA, and had in fact been working on a secret mission to preserve our species. With the decimation of many types of crops and the end of okra within a year, the blight is essentially feeding on the rich nitrogen sources found on the Earth, subsequently reducing the oxygen that is left on the planet, highlighting the near extinction of mankind and most things that inhabit the planet. It's explained that there had been many anomalies like the one Cooper had encountered in his home, but none as significant as the wormhole found on Saturn, which had been placed there by unknown persons 48 years prior. The wormhole essentially leads to another galaxy, which features 12 potentially habitable worlds that are within reach. These worlds are the locations of each of the Lazarus missions. Now, NASA's plan is initially revealed to be twofold. Plan A is to finish off the centrifuge space station that John had been working on, in the hopes of developing a new gravitational-based propulsion technology to allow for a mass exodus off the planet. Plan B is essentially to send the Endurance, along with 5,000 fertilized eggs and equipment to incubate their growth, with which they can colonize a habitable planet and ensure the survival of our species. It's not mentioned in the film, but I'm also assuming there are crops and equipment to cultivate food on the new planet. Murphy begs Cooper to stay, as another message she has discovered spells out stay, but Cooper is left with no choice but to leave. The beautiful song titled Stay, which plays throughout the film, was developed to encapsulate the feel of Interstellar prior to the script being completed. Nolan, who was a longtime friend and collaborator of Hans Zimmer, approached Zimmer and, without telling him what the film was about, had asked him to write a song about a father saying goodbye to his daughter without knowing when he would see her again.
Everybody good? Plenty of slaves for my robot colony?
I gave him a humor setting so he'd fit in better with his unit. He thinks it relaxes us.
A giant, sarcastic robot.
I truly felt that Tars was the metallic heart of the film, providing much needed humor in the otherwise depressing and bleak journey they have embarked on. Case, the other AI on the mission, though more reserved, is also hilarious at times. They both subverted my expectations. Having watched 2001: A Space Odyssey and seeing the menacing Hal, I thought that both the robots, if not one, would have a sinister turn, but they don't.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece is Christopher Nolan's favourite film of all time. It's no surprise then that much of 2001 inspired this film. From the grandiose shots of exploration, wormhole transportation, and epic musical scores that make you feel like you're on board a fantastical adventure, every portion of this film is crafted to encapsulate the beauty, scope, and terrifying realities of interstellar travel. Now, the three planets that Cooper, Romilly, Brand, and Doyle decide to head to are Miller's, Edmund's, and Dr. Mann's planets. It's explained to us that the Lazarus missions were led by Dr. Mann, who had inspired the other scientists to head to their planets with little to no chance of ever returning home. They make it through the wormhole safely and arrive at the unknown galaxy to interpret the last bit of data pinging from the three planets that was yet to reach Earth. Miller and Dr. Mann's planets have continued giving a thumbs up ping, but Edmund's signal had stopped transmitting 3 years prior. It's also explained that Miller's and Dr. Mann's planets are much closer to the black hole, which has been named Gargantua, which will have some serious repercussions, especially with regards to Miller's planet, which is on the horizon of Gargantua. This will cause their time on the planet to slow down significantly compared to the time that will elapse on Earth. For every hour they spend on Miller's planet, 7 years will have passed on Earth. Cooper is obviously hesitant to travel to Miller's planet for two reasons. The first is of course concern for how long he will be away from his children. The second is the realization that if Miller's planet is good for habitation, everyone on Earth will have died by the time that they begin colonizing the planet. They ultimately decide to head to Miller's planet, lured in by the data transmissions, which show that the planet contains water and other organic life. Cooper theorizes a plan to keep the Endurance in tandem orbit of both Gargantua and Miller's planet, which will ultimately use more fuel but save them time. Romilly volunteers to stay back and make observations on the effects of gravity, which is precisely the type of information that Dr. Brand will need back home to perfect his centrifuge. Cooper, Brand, and Doyle then use the lander to descend on Miller's planet, whose surface appears to be covered in shallow water. There is a faint sound of a clock that can be heard while they begin their exploration of the terrain for the signal, reinforcing the notion of how precious their time is here. The water is deceptively calm, and a brief glimpse of the distance reveals what appears to be mountains, but we soon discover that these are actually waves. Swelling to giant heights, another wave that had been creeping up behind them towers over the group as they struggled to make it back to the ship. What this essentially means is that Miller had landed on the planet 10 years earlier, had presumably exited her lander and turned on the beacon after viewing the deceptively calm water and what appeared to be mountains in the distance. Interestingly, if we take their theory of time dilation into consideration, in that 1 hour on Miller's planet is equal to 7 years of time passing on Earth, and we also note that 10 years had passed on Earth since Miller's departure and subsequent arrival, what this essentially means is that Cooper, Brand, Doyle, and Case had theoretically touched down on Miller's planet just under an hour and a half after Miller had herself arrived.
That's relativity, folks.
By the time the group make it back to Romilly on the Endurance, 23 years and 4 months have passed, both for the people back on Earth and Romilly, who was parked outside the gravitational pull of Gargantua. The poor man had essentially waited over 2 decades alone in space, not knowing if his team would return. Romilly explains that he had studied as much as he could from the black hole, but only so much can be done from a distance. He'd been constantly receiving messages from Earth, but has been unable to send anything back. It's here that Cooper watches the progression of his family, in the form of the messages relayed through his son, who himself doesn't know whether they are even reaching Cooper, due to the 23-year absence. He also sees his daughter, who sends him a message on her birthday, which marked the day that she was the same age as him when he had left. Although still quite resentful at the fact that he had left, she ultimately asks for him to come back. Well, that's all for today, folks. We'll pick back up with the continuation of the Endurance mission, a look at the Tesseract, and the conclusion of this astounding film. If there's any specific content you'd like me to cover, please let me know in the comments below. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
Find the gear, dumbass.
Grind it.
Shut it, Tom!
What'd you do, Murph?
She didn't do nothing. Blew the tires off.
Murphy's Law.
Shut up!
Grab a spare, Tom.
That is the spare.
What's going on, Murph?
Why did you and Mom name me after something that's bad?
Well, we didn't. Murphy's Law doesn't mean that something bad will happen. What it means is that whatever can happen will happen, and that sounded just fine with us.